YouTube, and how's it going? Welcome back to Kitchen Table Meta. So this week we're doing how to construct a competitive deck for Meta Monday number 5, which is the 5th week we've done this. This is awesome, and this is by far my favorite segment. I love doing this. I love talking about game theory. I love analyzing different aspects of the game, and so I'm always so excited when I do these. And so I got one of my favorite topics, and this is something I've been asked a lot to do, which was, how do I make the decks I make? I know I've got a lot of good feedback from the hand destruction deck. Same thing with the Emperor Frieza deck. I've had a lot of people ask me, like, how do I come up with these concepts? And I thought it would just make a really good Meta Monday, and I think it's a fantastic topic going into set 2, because now, like, at the beginning of every set, we have these huge, like, spikes of people creating decks. And so if you're not familiar with how to do it, or if you are but just want to kind of learn how I put my spin on it, I think this would be a great topic again going into set 2, and I'm just super excited to talk about it. So let's get started, and because this is probably going to be a pretty long video, guys. Again, once I start talking, it's really hard to get me to stop. And so we're going to start with the first topic, which is stop trying to break the game, learn it first. And I always say this all the time to people. They'll sit down and they'll be like, Dusty, I have this awesome idea how to break the game. I'm going to break the game. It's going to happen. And, while that does happen from time to time, obviously there's been aspects of different games where it's been broken. You really need to learn and understand the game first before you can actually break it, because, it's very rare that designers print cards that just straight out break the game. Usually you have to figure out some kind of weird concept or something that you don't know by just the first time you play the game, understand that first, and then once you get a good grasp of it, then you can start attacking that. And so the first little subplot here that I always talk about is the first thing we need to do is we need to dissect the meta and build a gauntlet. And so what that means is with set 1, or the first set with games, the first thing we have to do is we have to create the meta, right? We have to know what decks are strong so that we can attack that meta and we can build a deck, that can survive in that environment. And so currently in our game, I'll kind of give an example of what I'm talking about. So currently I think there's 3 decks that are the meta. They're the 3 decks that if you go to an event, you're probably going to find these, at least one of these decks there. And if you play one of these 3 decks and you really learn it and master it, you're probably going to be in a good spot when you go to an event. And this is the Vegeta Hand Destruction deck. In my opinion, this is probably the best deck currently in the format. It does really good against the other decks. It does its own thing. It doesn't, rely on anything else. Your opponent doesn't have to be playing something and then it does well against that. It just is a threat. It comes out, it does its thing. It is very consistent and it's really hard to stop. Next up is the Ginyu Tricolor deck. That's a deck that Jordan played at the RRG events, and really it's been really popular ever since. That's a very strong control deck, and it's a deck that's very powerful. And then finally, we have the green blue Goku deck, and this is the starter deck of Goku, and this is the one that's like probably the best mid-range deck we currently have in the game. Very powerful, very strong deck. Now, if you pick up one of these 3 decks, like I said earlier, you're going to do a fantastic job. You're going to do really well in your locals or even at competitive events. Now that we have this learn, now we know what these decks are. To create a good deck, to make sure that we have a deck and we build it, what I mean by a gauntlet is we've created it. We have our 3 decks. Now we have to figure out how to beat these decks. So when we create a deck, we want to play against each one of these decks and see how our matchups are. If we struggle to one, then we want to improve it and make it better against that matchup and then test it against the other one. Because whenever you strengthen a deck or take something away that makes it better against one deck, it's very possible that you make it weak against the other one. And whenever that happens, you're kind of spinning your wheels, and you don't want to create the 4th deck on this list, right? You want to create the one that's better than all of these lists. So I've seen a lot of people do that. They'll make a deck that's really good against hand destruction, but it suffers to the other 2. And so when they take it to an event or something, if everyone isn't playing hand destruction, they just kind of lose and they'll do very well. And so that's very important. So, with me saying that, the next step is we need to find those decks' weakness we just talked about and make sure we have one of those weaknesses built into our deck. And so, for example, for the hand destruction deck, its weakness is awakening, right? It hates when its opponent awakens because that just gives them tons of cards. It refills their hand. It makes it really hard for them to strip those cards out of their hand. For the Ginyu deck, it really has a hard time with their energy. So if there's any way we can attack their energy, which we've seen some cards do that in set 2, that's a great way to attack it. Next is like the extra cards. They have tons of extra cards in their hand, and if you can find a way to make those extra cards dead, if you can find a way to make Crusher Ball not as effective, make Cold Bloodlust not as effective, then that deck is going to struggle. And then finally, an aggressive leader. If you can get a leader that does a lot of damage or that puts a lot of pressure on them, then that's really good against the Ginyu decks, because all of their threats and all their plan is to literally just kill your threats every time or make your threats not very good. They want to attack your battle cards. And if you put your game plan onto your leader, then you've now, kind of put them off balance, right? A lot of their cards are dead in their hand, and so that's how you can attack the Ginyu deck. Last up is the green blue Goku deck, Starter deck Goku. Now they struggle a lot in the early game. Their early game is really bad because I'm not gonna say really bad, but it's not as good as a lot of the other decks. And they have a lot of times where they do what I call draw go, where they'll just draw a card. They don't have a play yet because they have a lot of 4 and 5 cost cards in their deck, and they just draw a card and go, it's your turn. They might attack with their leader maybe, but they'll just go draw your go, draw your go for like the first 3 or 4 turns, and then on that turn 4, that turn 5, that's when their leader comes into play. That's when they playing like a 4-drop, and they play like maybe they play Go Tinks into another 4-drop, and it's just the scary like snowball effect. And so another thing too is they have a very small hand. They don't have a lot of cards in their hand to start out, so they are weak to hand destruction. They are weak to attacking them and putting a lot of pressure on them and making them have to use their hand to survive. That's again a good way that you can attack all 3 of these decks. And so once you have this idea, once you know these weaknesses of these decks, you're like, okay, here's what we're gonna do. This is our plan. Now you need to realize what cards take advantage of these weaknesses. So for example, if the hand destruction deck, its weakness is Awakening, right? Well, we have Result of Training is a great card for that. We have TN coming in the next set. That's a great way to get your deck to awaken. So make sure that once you know the weakness that you can tie a card to it. Same thing with the Ginyu Tricolor. Know that cards like Broly the Rampaging Horse, 6-drop Broly is really bad against them. Almost every, if you play it out, they have to get rid of 2 cards. If they Crusher Ball it, you don't care because it's a 30,000 attacker and it's really hard for them to kill that. And even if they do kill it, it doesn't matter because you've already taken 2 cards out of their hand. So it's already kind of done its thing. If they Cold Bloodlust it, well, they discarded 1 card out of their hand, which is fine. And then you can use that card, because it's a 30,000 attacker, to pressure their battle cards or even pressure their leader and make them use more cards to survive, so he kind of just gets more cards out of their hand anyway. It's a card that does what it needs to do, even if it gets Cold Bloodlust or Crusher Balled, and that's important against that deck. Next up, we have 3 drops and hand destruction is again very good against the green blue Goku decks. That's something else to remember. Include these cards in. Make sure you have an idea. If you know a deck is weak to something, make sure that your deck has cards that can take advantage of that weakness. And then finally, the last thing I'll say in all capital letters, I'll probably have it like flashing somehow, is the meta is different in each area, right? I've seen it happen millions of times. I've seen people, they'll go online, they'll see a skeleton of a deck, they'll see something they really want to play, like a hand destruction deck. They'll build that deck, they'll take it to their local meta, and they get murdered. And they're like, man, this hand destruction deck is really bad. Or, man, this Ginyu deck is really bad. And it's like, no, it's not. It's just not tuned for your meta. So make sure that, just because people aren't playing these 3 decks, they might be playing 3 other decks. And so don't add these 3 decks to your gauntlet if no one plays them in your area. If someone plays Champa and some other guy, plays Hit, then put those decks in your gauntlet and practice against them. Make sure you have a way to beat those decks. All right, guys, so the next big topic that I'll talk about is you need to create a foundation. You need to make sure that you have a solid foundation whenever you build a deck. You need to make sure it makes sense, that it's strong, just like building a building, right? We don't want to, build on shaky ground, so we don't want to build a deck with shaky ground. So the first thing I'll talk about right here is picking a leader. I feel like this is one of the most important things to start with when you're building a deck, is you need to have a leader. You need to have he's like your general, right? Like your leader is like the person that, essentially your deck should be designed around. And this game's a little bit different than other games where your leader doesn't have to be the same color as the cards in your deck. And so you can play Frieza, which is a yellow leader, and put just red and green cards in your deck. And so because of that, I think it's really important to start with a leader, start with an idea. Now, you don't have to do this. You can start with a deck idea and then include a leader in later. It's fine. In my testing, I like to start with a leader first, because that way I can kind of get an idea of what works. And I feel like there's a lot of themes in this game where it's like, if I want to build like a Frieza army deck, I have to start with the Frieza leader, for example. So anyway, I want to get into this. So you want to make sure you have a plan when you pick your leader. What does this leader bring to your deck, right? So if you're wanting to play a control deck, right? What's a leader that's good for control decks? Well, the first thing that comes to mind to me is Beerus. Beerus is a great leader for that. He has a way to kill battle cards. The new Cell we saw, great leader for that. Vados could even be a good leader for that. But why would I pick Vados over another card? Why would I pick, Beerus over Cell? And a good example for that would be, okay, let's say I like Cell. I think Cell is very good in the current set 2. I think he's going to be awesome. I want to build a control deck. I want to play Cell. But then I start putting a lot of blue cards in my deck, and I feel like those cards are the best. Well, then maybe Cell isn't the best pick. Maybe instead I want to pick Beerus, So that way I'll have Piccolos in my deck, the 0-cost combo card in my deck, and then I can run the 1-drop God that we saw, the Kai or whatever. They can look at the top 3 and pick a God, and my 0-cost combo card is a God because Piccolo's a God, and now I have changed my leader to make it more efficient with my deck. That's what you should be thinking the whole time that you're picking your leader. What does this bring to my deck? Do I need a board wipe? Am I getting overrun? I don't have enough cards to kill a board wipe. Okay, so instead of running Beerus, maybe I'll run Gohan now, and so that way if I can awaken him, I can now have a board wipe. Those are how you should think. Think about what is killing you, what is beating you, what is your leader going to do? Is he going to strengthen your deck, or is he going to weaken it, or is he just going to be there just to be there? You just want to play Beerus because you like Beerus isn't a good enough reason to build a competitive deck. Next up is a little sub thing is make sure you have a plan to awaken. One of my favorite plans I've ever had to awaken with a leader is my Frieza deck. I love that deck because I thought completely outside the box in order to awaken this leader, and that was really, really important with me because with Vegeta, you just literally take a life every turn. With Ginyu the same way. With Frieza, I had to be like, okay, what is gonna, I have no way to make this leader awaken. There's no way to do it. I'm running blue, red. The only way I can make him awaken is to use Result Training, which seems weird in the deck. I don't want to run 5 energy. How am I going to do it? So I ran Kabas to help me do that. But then I realized I was losing a lot to the green counter and just Goldos, anything that could pressure my Kabas. I was like, man, this deck is really relying on Kabas. Is there another way I can awaken? Because if I can't get past this, the deck is never going to work. And then I thought, you know what? If I just be super aggressive to my opponent, I can take cards out of their hand. I can put a lot of pressure on them. And then since they can't attack my cards, for them to get that card advantage, for them to be able to attack and draw a card on their awaken side, they have to attack my leader every turn. So they have to make this decision. Do they want to awaken me and draw a card themselves, or do they not want to draw a card? And then I've kind of taken away their awaken effect. So that's just make sure you think outside the box. Make sure you come up with different ways to awaken so that your deck doesn't get stalled out, because that's one way you really don't want to lose this game. Next up is you want to build your core. You want to find a way to build the core of your deck. You need to have a solid foundation. So we need to have cards that can take advantage of it. And so the first thing is, what is your deck doing? What's your plan? What is in my mind, there's 5 different archetypes of decks in this game right now. And so which one of these archetypes is your deck? And so number 1, we'll talk about hand destruction, right? In this type of deck, they want to take cards out of your hand and make you not have very many cards in your hand, right? And since this game is really reliant on how many cards are in your hand so you can combo and stay alive, it's really easy for them to take cards out of your hand, attack you with big threats. You can't survive those threats, and they'll beat you that way. Next up is aggro. This is the essentially they just play out tons of threats and they want to kill you as fast as possible. Next up is control. This is exactly the opposite of aggro. It's essentially they don't want to play that much the first turn. They just play a bunch of cards that give them value, and they want to keep killing your battle cards and then beat you with big, beefy threats that you can't deal with as an aggro deck or mid-range deck. Next up is mid-range, and this is what I think that confuses a lot of people. But essentially, what this deck, what mid-range is, I guess in layman's terms, is just it's a deck that wants to play stuff in the mid of the game, like around turn 4 and 5. They want to play a bunch of 5-cost or 4-cost battle cards that are pretty strong and can overwhelm aggro decks and put a lot of pressure on control decks. And so they kind of want to go under control decks a little bit. They want to come out and essentially have these kind of mid-rangey threats that are very powerful, but not as powerful, like game enders. They just want to swarm you with these kind of mid-range type cards. And then last is ramp, and this is a archetype that's very strong in this game. Essentially, what ramp wants to do is it wants to put out more energy. In this game, you can only play 1 energy a turn, and so this wants to make sure that it can play 1 a turn, maybe 2 a turn, and sometimes even 3 energy a turn. And once it gets up to those high energy numbers, then it plays 7 and 8 drops on turn 5 and 6. So essentially, it's playing a big threat that it normally would come later in the game, earlier in the game, and that's what ramp does. And so once you pick which one of these decks you want, you need to figure out what cards make that archetype work. And so for hand destruction, it's the Broly line. For aggro, it's cheap threats like Kaba, or critical threats like the critical Vegeta or Goku that we've seen. The critical cards put a lot of pressure on your opponent because they have to either respond to them, or use cards out of their hand to not die to them, or not take hits from them, because when they get hit by critical, they lose their life card. They don't get to draw it. And so that's why critical threats are so powerful in aggro decks. Control decks, they want stuff like negate so they can survive the early game, and they want big game enders, like like Whis, the 12-drop Whis that just comes in and essentially as soon as they play it, they're just like, I win. I'm like, there's nothing you could do. Sorry, dude. The next type is mid-range decks. They want like Gotenks. 5-drop Gotenks is like the mid-range king. You know, that's like exactly what that deck wants to do. It wants to play out Gotenks, ready 2 of its energy, attack with starter Goku, ready 2 more, play out a 4-drop. You know, and just have these really, you know, again, like powerful 5-drops to take over the game. And then finally, ramp decks want cards like Objection and Whis. And so you want to make sure once you've chosen, you know, this core, you want to make sure that you give each card a job. What is each card trying to do? You know, you don't want any, like I call them freeloader cards, right? You don't want a card in your deck that just does nothing, right? It just sits there and doesn't, you know, build to the strategy. And so you want to make sure that you do that. You want to make sure that you have a card that has a job in this core, that every card in this core is like absolutely necessary. And sometimes this is 12 cards, sometimes it's 20 cards. But once you have this core, you just want to take that core and set it off to the side. And then finally, you want to essentially build your supplement cards. You want to build your cards that strengthen your matchups and add them to the core, and that will create, you know, your foundation, that will create your deck that you're wanting to build. So the next thing I'll talk about in the core, or creating a foundation, is you want to create a curve. You want to make sure that you have the game understood. And a lot of times when I talk about the curve, I always do like the curve, is that you want to have something you play on turn 1. You want to have something that you have an idea of something you do on turn 2, turn 3, and so it makes this curve. But then once you get up, you know, depending on your deck, so if you're an aggro deck, right, you want something on turn 1, right, that's going to be go up, and then you want something for sure on turn 2, and then turn 3, definitely, and then turn 4 is not going to be that many cards that you want. Turn 5, maybe next to nothing, and so it makes this little curve shape. You know, you want a lot of stuff and then none. And so, you know, you want to make sure you have that curve of your deck. Wherever it starts going down with, you just need to, you don't want like 18 4-drops and then, you know, 22, you know, 5-drops, because then your curve is like flat and does nothing. So you want to make sure you're doing stuff early game, you're doing some stuff, you know, in the mid game, and then, you know, if you're a control deck, you wanted to keep doing stuff later in the game, but if you're not, then you want to start bringing it down. Next up is, you know, what does your best hand look like? Always imagine, like, when you put cards into your deck, like, man, what is my god hand? You know, what if I draw 6 cards at the beginning, what are those 6 cards going to be? What do I hope they are? And then, you know, from there you can say, okay, well, you know, for example, you know, hand destruction, Broly's the best card. I want as many Broly cards as I can get, and that way you can start mulligan for that. And then you're like, you know what, actually, after I've tested a little bit, Objection's really good too. And so now you want, you know, Broly's and you want Objection in your hand. You can start figuring out what your best hand is, and that way you can start creating your deck, creating that core, because usually those cards that are the best in your hand is your core, right? That's like, that's the cards that are the strongest in your deck. And then finally, the last thing I'll talk about in building your core is imagining your matches. I do this a lot. I do a lot of times where even when I'm building the deck, I'll have it laid out and I'll be thinking about it. I'll be like, okay, if I'm playing against Ginyu, okay, on turn 1, I'll play Broly. I'll play Broly out. I'll look at the top 7. I'll pick another Broly. I'll pass turn. Now, what will he do on his turn? Well, if he plays out Goldo, he can tap my Broly and attack and kill it. So I probably shouldn't play Broly on turn 1. And so I won't think of Broly as a turn 1 play against Ginyu. So what should I be playing on turn 1? What else can I do on turn 1? Well, I could put Boo in my deck. And if I have Boo in my deck, I can play him out turn 1 and draw a card. And that helps me draw for Objection. That helps me draw for other Brolys. And then if he uses Goldo to kill my Boo, it's not that big of a deal, right? And that's so since I'm imagining those plays, I can start figuring out what new cards I can add into the deck, what cards I can take out, and kind of how I want to play the match. And again, guys, this is very important. This is something you can do by yourself. And it also, you know, kind of helps you in those matchups, right? It makes you think. And when you do this, just always pretend that your opponent has the best card every turn. I've had a lot of people, I'll see them play out Broly with the hand destruction deck, and I'll be like, hey, man, you shouldn't do that. And they're like, well, they could not have, you know, a Goldo and not kill my guy. And it's like, true, but they could also have it and kill your guy, and then you're really far behind if they do that, right? And so, again, you know, always pretend like your opponent has the best card. Now, there's certain times when you're losing, and I'll get into this more in the game theory and more about, you know, playing competitive matches, but there's certain times where you're just on the ropes and you need to just play into something just because doing nothing is worse than doing something. But just make sure that you just, again, when you're building your decks, just make sure that they imagine your matches, make sure you have a plan, and that your plan is always, you know, consistent, and you're pretending like your opponent always has the best card. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about when creating a competitive deck, and this is the most important part, guys. This is something that I am a huge advocate of, and I want to, you know, kind of, you know, drive this point home to you guys, and that is test, 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 and then test some more. Like, it's so important to test. I know in all the times I've played, competitive games, I've played a lot of competitive games. I've played professional games for a long time. And honestly, the only reason that I've been so good at games is because I test and because I practice. And honestly, it's the hardest thing to do because it takes the most time, right? Whenever I played Magic and I was trying to win a GP that he was here locally, I was practicing on Magic Online for 16 hours a day. Easy. I would just play all the time. And that's all I would do. I just play, change my deck, play, change some more. And I know that's a lot of time. I know that a lot of people can't put that time into the game. And to build a competitive deck, you don't have to play for 16 hours. But to get an idea of, like, I guess, the top end of things, the more you play, the more you learn about the game. And that is how you become a good player. And it's also why a lot of players don't become good players, is because they don't take enough time to focus on testing, which is a different topic for a different day. I don't want to keep getting distracted, but just remember, test a lot. Make sure you're testing. If you're trying to build a deck, you're trying to break a format, you're trying to, make a very powerful deck, you have to test. You have to figure out what's weak to that deck and then fix it. And so the next thing I'll talk about, and this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, is you always want to try bad cards while testing and evaluate them. Why are they bad, right? If you look at a card, you go, this card's bad, I will almost immediately put that card in my deck. And when I put those cards in my deck, I always put 4 of them in my deck. Always. I'm like 4 of those in my deck because I want to make sure that I see that card in the game and I can see why it's bad and why it's, why it surprises me and is good. Again, another thing about bad cards break games, guys, not good ones, right? The designers are very aware of how good the good cards are, right? They're very aware of how good Beerus is. They are very aware of how good, Tien is or the Broly line, right? Like that doesn't surprise them when someone plays out a card that does exactly what it says on the card, right? That's not something that they're surprised about. But bad cards in conjunction with those good cards is often what breaks them. And a good example of this is Callblade for Magic. If no one's familiar with Magic, that's still a fun story to tell. And that is a deck that essentially was made and essentially it ran a bunch of kind of bad cards at the time, right? It ran this card called Squadron Hawk, which was almost unplayable, and then it also ran Jace the Mind Sculptor, which actually turned out to be one of the best or the most powerful planeswalkers ever made. But at the time, the websites were selling them for $20. They thought it was bad and terrible. And actually, eventually, it got up to be about a $150 card, I think, maybe even more than that. It actually got to be so expensive that it actually rose the price of booster boxes because people could just buy a booster box. And if they got one of those cards, they actually made money off the booster box. So again, but these were 2 bad cards. I'm not going to go into details of why I was broken because this isn't a Magic channel. But just remember, so those are 2 cards that were literally labeled bad and ended up actually breaking an entire format. And actually, Squadron Hawk never got banned, but Jace got banned, eventually. So again, just don't let people tell you a card is bad. All cards have a purpose, and even if they are bad, there's always ways to break. And usually, whenever I'm trying to break a game, whether it's a card game or a video game or whatever, I look at the stuff that's considered bad first before I ever look at the stuff that's considered good. Next up is give a card a chance before you remove them from your deck. I've seen people do this a lot of the times. They'll take this 4 card that they think is awesome. They'll be like, I'm ready for this card. It's so good. It's awesome. Put it in my deck. Here we go. And they'll lose a game and they go, oh, it's this 4 card's fault. It was this card's fault, so I lost. And they take those 4 cards, they throw them away, they don't play them anymore. And oftentimes it wasn't those 4 cards, but also make sure you give them a chance. Make sure you play with those cards for at least 3 matches. Make sure you sit down, play with them, and then, before you think about cutting it, just make sure you get some testing in with it. Make sure you've at least drawn it. I've seen people put 4 cards in their deck, play 3 matches, and cut the card and never even drew it before. They didn't even get a card in their hand. And so, like, how can you properly evaluate the card if you've never actually played with it, And so just make sure you do that, guys. Make sure you're getting some actual testing in with the card before you just say it's bad and remove it. And then also make sure you have a reason. Like, why are you cutting the card, right? Like, let's say I have 4 objection in my hand, and I'm like, you know what? I'm cutting the card. I hate objection. I'm taking it out. Why am I doing that? Is it because I have too many 2-drops? Is it because I'm doing other things on 2? Is it because I don't need the ramp? Why am I cutting the card? And then after I cut the card, what can I replace it with that is doing what this card isn't doing? And so, for example, if I already have a lot of 2-drops and I don't need objection because it just never seems to be the best play, well, then I don't need to cut objection and put more 2-drops in. I need to cut objection and maybe put a 3-drop in or 4-drop in. And that way, I'm strengthening my match and not, weakening it, not just doing the same thing, running into the same mistakes. Also, another thing to remember while you're testing is make sure that you set down, and this is more of just a general tip, and I guess in general, but it's really really important when you're building a deck as well, is why did you lose the game? Why did you lose or win the game, right? I've seen a lot of people, they'll always talk about why they lost the game. We'll sit down, they'll be like, ugh, I lost because this card sucks, or I lost because I didn't see my objections, or I lost because I didn't draw any counters. But they never talk about why they won the game, right? And a lot of time it's hard to build for losing the game, right? So I guess in those last scenarios, I can just add more negates to my deck, or I can, maybe add more objections to my deck or more ramp to my deck. But, a lot of times, why are you winning the game, right? If you're playing hand destruction and you play out Beerus on turn 7 after they have no hand, and you attack and you blow up their board, right? And then you beat them with Beerus, it's really easy to look at that and say, I won because of Beerus. Beerus is awesome. But did you really win because of Beerus? Because they had no hand before you played Beerus. So were you actually just winning anyway? Like, is Beerus a win more card? Like, did you need to play Beerus? Maybe we cut Beerus out and replace Beerus with some cards that will let us get to that empty hand faster. Maybe, that's the way we strengthen the deck and make it better. A lot of the times it's not the card you just played that made you win. A lot of times you've already won the game way before then, or even lost the game way before then. And so you need to identify those points in the game and figure out how you can strengthen your deck, to take advantage of those things, that you've discovered. And the last is, this is a common mistake I've seen a lot in Magic. And it's something I want to bring to attention with this game, since officially, competitively, with the regionals coming up, they are best of 3. And that is, you need to test more with sideboarding than you need to test without them. I've seen a lot of people, they'll sit down, they'll test, and their opponent will be like, okay, I want to sideboard. And they'll be like, dude, why are you sideboarding, man? Why are you building your deck to beat mine, man? Why are you doing it? And it's like, well, the reason why is because, and why it might seem like it stinks that your opponent sits down, in just a game that you're playing with your friends and starts sideboarding, right? It might seem like he's trying hard or taking it too serious. In reality, you actually play more games in a best of 3 with sideboard than you play without them. But when a lot of people test, they test a lot more without a sideboard than with it. So when they get into a match, they don't understand how to sideboard, and they lose a lot of games because of it. And so just remember that in a best of 3, you play 2 games with the sideboard and then 1 game without it. And so you need to make sure that you're playing and testing with sideboards and come up with a really strong sideboard plan, because it is important in best of 3 formats. Okay, guys, so that's it for the video. That's it for my tips on how to create a competitive deck. Especially going into set 2, guys, make sure you take these ideas and you apply them as best you can. But let me know what your guys' tips are. What's some things I missed? How do you guys make your competitive decks? I've seen a lot of awesome decks come out of the community, so I'm really excited to see what I might do differently than maybe you guys do. Also, guys, thank you so much again for all the support. I know I say this after every video, but it really means so much to me. We've reached over 500 subscribers, which I say it all the time, but that was my goal to do in a year, and we did it in 3 weeks, and we're actually almost up to 600. So you guys just continue to surprise me. You continue to give me so much support, and it just really, really means a lot. Now, I will have a special video on Wednesday that will come out. I want to, essentially it's a thank you video. I just want to talk to you guys, tell you all how much it means to me of all the support I've got. Also, my plans with the channel moving forward, and just kind of, going over all the stuff I've been working on. So it's just a video to give back to you guys, because you guys have given me so much support, and I feel like I need to be doing a lot more for you guys as well. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Catch me tomorrow for Top 5 Tuesday. I have a very spicy topic to talk about with that. And so, guys, again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.